Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for attending this webinar today. So I'm going to just start off by introducing myself, and then I'm going to introduce the team. So my name is Stephen. I'm a vice chair of the St. Basil's Youth Advisory Board. So that's me. Akeem.
Yeah, so my name is Hakin. I'm currently at Gillett Road in St. Basil's accommodation. I'm also a vice chair. Unfortunately, the chair, Abby, she couldn't be here today because she had some other things to take care of. But we're just going to jump right into this presentation.
Thank you. Much appreciated. So alongside me and Akeem today is also Tamsin and Barry, but they will not be pretty much facilitating this webinar today. That will be me and Akeem. So the purpose for today's webinar is pretty much to speak to Dr. Justin Varney, pretty much to, get all of the factual information, and pretty much allow the young people of St. Basil's to formulate an opinion based on the facts rather than the speculation that we see on social media today. It's not pretty much to force you or, encourage you to take the vaccine. It's pretty much to gather all of the information to allow you to have an opinion in order for you to decide whether you want to take that vaccine or not. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Justin Varney, who is the Director for Public Health in Birmingham.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Hakeem. So I'm going to try and share my screen, which is always a question mark of whether it works. So can one of you guys give me a thumbs up if you can see this? Great, fabulous. Well, that's a good start. Right, all right. So what I thought I'd do is I'll just start by giving a short presentation, just so we're all on the same page when we're talking about vaccines and COVID, because there's so much information out there and it's really easy to just get sucked in to a whole load of really bad science. So I'm going to start with some of the basics. Apologies if it feels a little bit like GCSE biology, but hopefully I'll go through it reasonably quickly. So COVID-19 comes from a family of viruses called the coronavirus family. If you think about tomatoes, there's loads of different types of tomatoes, but they're all tomatoes. And that's the same with coronavirus. There are lots of different types of coronaviruses. Some of them cause common cold. Some of them are things like SARS, which were very serious. And COVID-19 is a new version that developed in December 2019 in the Wuhan region of China. The most common symptoms are a high temperature, dry cough, or a loss of taste or smell, but people often have other symptoms. So some people get an upset stomach, some people get a real headache, but they usually have at least one of the three. They may not have all three, but they usually have at least one. Of those who develop symptoms, about 80% get through it without ending up in hospital. About 15% require oxygen and have to go into hospital, and about 5% become critically ill and end up in intensive care. And that stayed pretty stable through the whole pandemic, those kind of numbers. The virus is spread through little droplets that come out of our mouths and our nose. So when we breathe, if you breathe against the window, you see all that fog, that steam. Those little droplets are what carry COVID. And the virus gets into our body through our eyes, our nose, or our mouth. It can't burrow through our skin. It's not a great mountain climber, so it can't get from your hands onto your face unless you touch your face. And that's how it gets into your body. So that's why we wash our hands, why the physical distancing was there to keep the distance between people. Wearing a face covering is about keeping your own droplets close to your own face. It does protect you a little bit from other people's, but it does most by keeping your stuff close to your face. And ventilation is really important now. So if you think about someone who's smoking, as a director of public health, I'm going to say filthy habit. But if you think about that cloud of smoke on a still day when there's no wind, that cloud just sits there. And if you're walking behind someone who's smoking, you just walk straight through it and you can smell it and you can taste it. On a windy day, that cloud really quickly disappears and it becomes so thin you can't see it. And the same is true for that cloud of COVID coming out of someone's mouth. If a room's well ventilated, the cloud disappears, but if it's not, then it's going to sit there hanging around and you're going to walk straight through it. So that's just a bit about COVID. Two types of tests. Unfortunately, you can't get away at the moment of a test without sticking a swab up your nose and the back of your throat. In the PCR test, that goes off to the lab. The lab uses a very sensitive machine, so it finds even tiny amounts of the virus that are on the swab, and it's very good at saying whether you've got COVID or not. What it's not great at doing is saying how infectious you are, because it doesn't make a judgment of how much COVID there is. It just says you have it or you don't. The rapid test, the one you do at home that gives you like results in 30 minutes, same swab, nose and throat, but it's going on a bit of fancy paper. And that's only really good at finding it when there's lots of virus in your nose and your throat. And that's why we use that test for people who haven't got symptoms but could be infectious. We know about 1/3 of people who have got no symptoms have COVID and are infectious with it. So it's a good way of finding out, am I infectious today? But it's not a great way of finding out, have I got COVID? Because it's not very good at early or late disease. So moving on to vaccines. Vaccines have been with us for a long time. If you'll excuse the somewhat military analogy, but if you think about our body defends itself in 3 main ways. The castle bit is our skin and our stomach. So that's our kind of physical defense. Then we have a kind of general immune defense system. That's just like any old soldiers. They'll run at anything that breaks through the castle walls and they'll have a go at trying to kill it. And then we have our special immune system, which is what our antibodies are part of, and they learn to recognize a particular type of enemy and they are trained to attack that only. So you have the kind of 3 layers. And what vaccination does is it teaches those special attack forces to attack a particular type of infection, in this case, a virus. Vaccine's been with us since around 200 BC. The Chinese first invented it, although most of us in school learnt about Dr. Edward Jenner and cowpox, because you know how we like to reinvent history around what white people did. Well, the reality is the Chinese were there a long time ago. And vaccines, as I said, teach us to respond to infections by exposing us to usually a bit of the infection. And it's usually a bit of the outside coat. So if you think about a virus having an outside coat, and on that coat there are buttons, and those buttons are the thing that we use in the vaccine to promote a response. So the bit that we recognize, and that's a protein spike, is that button. There are loads of different ways that vaccines introduce the buttons into our body. So in some cases, they stick the buttons on another virus. In some cases, they use a dead virus with its own coat and its own buttons. In others, they give us like an instruction sheet. So the vaccine gives the instruction sheet on how to make the buttons to the factory bit of our cells, and we just churn out buttons for a bit. But it's a bit like a spy movie where that recipe sheet burns up. You can only use it once. So the vaccine isn't in our body forever. It burns up quite quickly. And we just produce those buttons, the protein, while that recipe card is there from the vaccine. Once it's gone, it's gone. Our body doesn't remember how to do it because it doesn't go anywhere near our DNA. It just sits in the factory bit of the cells. And the DNA, the kind of head office bit of our cells, stays in its office and doesn't come out. So vaccines all follow the same way they're developed. They all follow the same path, and the same is true for COVID. So we start off in the lab, we do fun stuff in test tubes and try and work out, is the vaccine a goer? Then we try it in animals, and if it works in animals, then we move on to human trials. And there are 3 levels of human trials. The first is, does it work? The first is it safe? The second is, does it work? And the third is, does it work in lots of different types of people? So does it work in different ethnicities, different ages, people with different conditions? Then once the researchers have done all of that, they send their results to the regulator, which in the UK is the MHRA. They look at the raw data. So they don't just listen to what the pharma companies say. They look at the raw data and they decide, is the vaccine, does it do what it says it is, and is it safe? If they say yes, they set conditions on how it can be used, and then it's taken out into production. All the way through this, there is independent safety monitoring. So that includes visits to testing sites. It includes a reporting system where anyone who has a serious side effect reports it through what's called the yellow card. And all of that happens both during the research phase, but it carries on when vaccines go out into the real world forever. So even today, if you have a bad reaction to a measles and mumps vaccine, you still fill in the same yellow card and that goes off to the regulator and is monitored. So we keep monitoring it forever. Now, people often ask, how come the COVID vaccine got created so quickly? Isn't there, there must be something dodgy here. Well, the three things that were different for COVID was, first of all of this costs a lot of money. And in normal times, if you want to do a new vaccine, say for a disease like Ebola, you've got to fundraise. You've got to find people who are going to pay for the labs and the research and everything else. In COVID, the World Bank basically just said, how much do you want? We're going to pay for anything you need. So across the world, governments and the World Bank put loads of money into funding these trials. The second bit is that bit with the regulator. Each stage, between each stage, the lab trials, the animal trials, and each of the 3 stages of the human trials, you have to go back to the regulator and ask permission. And in normal times, those meetings only happen once every couple of months. So you might have missed the meeting and you go and say, I want to present so I can move on. And they say, I'm sorry, it was on Tuesday and the next one's not for 6 months, you've got to wait. Well, in COVID, they said, no, we'll call it again in 2 weeks' time. So you don't have to wait anymore. The third and final reason it was faster was when you're doing a vaccine, you get to that last stage of the trial, when you're giving it to lots of people, you want to do that in a country where there's lots of the disease. And the problem is, if there isn't a lot of the disease, you have to kind of wait till it appears to know whether the vaccine is really working at scale. Well, of course, with COVID, there was loads of COVID everywhere, so they didn't have to wait. So those are the reasons it was faster. First of all, money was thrown at it. 2, all the committees met when they needed to, rather than saying, I'm sorry, I'm busy. And 3, there was loads of COVID around, and therefore lots of people volunteered, but also actually you didn't have to wait for the disease to appear. So moving on to the vaccines, there are 3 vaccines approved in the UK, Pfizer, Moderna, and Astrazeneca. They all work in a similar way in that they all use that recipe card, the kind of one-time only James Bond recipe card, and that's how they teach our body to make the protein. The difference between them is Pfizer and Moderna introduce the recipe card in an artificial envelope. So it's basically a fat bubble that's been created in a lab, and it's designed to stick to our cells and introduce the recipe card into our cells. Now, the Astrazeneca one uses a type of animal virus. It's a monkey cold virus that gets used in other vaccines like the flu vaccine. And that's a kind of more traditional way of introducing the recipe card. But they're both pretty similar in terms of they use the same genetic recipe card to instruct the factory bits of our cells, what are called the mitochondria, to produce the protein spike. So our body recognizes them and produces antibodies. There's similar level of effectiveness after 2 doses, but it does take about 2 weeks after the vaccine for it to come into effect. So that's why with the isolation guidance, you only get to skip isolation if you've had 2 doses and you're 14 days after the second one. None of the vaccines contain any animal products, and they don't contain any bits of baby, any fecal products. They do contain very, very, very small amounts of alcohol. It's the same amount of alcohol that's in bread. And, I didn't know before I started to do this work that bread contained alcohol, but fermentation with yeast produces alcohol as a byproduct. All of the world faiths have agreed that the amount of alcohol in the vaccines is acceptable under their religion. So the Islamic faith have approved it. Hasidic Jews have approved it. They've all said it's absolutely fine. This is what they would consider naturally occurring levels of alcohol, and therefore is acceptable under every religion in the world. So in terms of side effects, all medicines have side effects. Even if it's just paracetamol, still has side effects, some of which can be very serious but are very rare. And vaccines are no different. So most people, you'll get a sore arm where you had the injection. Usually the next day you'll feel a bit tired, a bit fluey, a bit achy. If you have the Pfizer vaccine, you normally get a really bad dead arm. And it's like someone's punched you in the arm. It's a pretty bad one. If you have the AstraZeneca one, you probably have a bad headache. Now, Some of you will be too young to know what hangover feels like. But for those of you that you do recognize that description, it's very much like having a hangover. Normally lasts about a day, up to 3 days. Anything more than 3 days, people should talk to a doctor, but it's unusual to have it more than a day afterwards. And you usually only get those side effects with the first dose. With the second dose, you don't normally have any. There are some very rare side effects. And like I said, like paracetamol, every medicine has rare side effects. So the 3 rare side effects that people talk about are there's clots associated with the Astrazeneca vaccine. The risk of having a clot with an Astrazeneca vaccine is about 100 times less than the risk of having a clot with the oral contraceptive pill. And it's about 1,000 times less than the risk of having a serious clot if you're a smoker. And to put that in perspective, the risk of having a clot with AstraZeneca is about the same risk of you being killed in a car accident if you drive from London to Birmingham once. So it's a very, very rare risk. The other 2 risks you might have heard about, which we're seeing in America because they're doing more vaccination of young people, is that with all vaccines, there is a risk of a thing called pericarditis and a thing called myocarditis. So pericarditis is inflammation of the muscle and the lining around the heart, and myocarditis is inflammation of your heart muscle. And they're both quite serious conditions, but we know with other vaccines, they do happen in young adults. And what we're seeing in America and in France and now in Germany, who have vaccinated millions of young people, that the frequency of them happening with the COVID vaccine is no more than what happens with the meningitis vaccine. So it is a known side effect of vaccines. It's very rare and it can be treated, but what we're seeing is it's no more common with COVID vaccine than it is with anything else. So those are the kind of side effects that have been shown to have happened. We monitor side effects carefully. That's what the yellow card is. And that's why we know, for example, there are no serious side effects for pregnant women. There is no evidence of the vaccines affecting fertility. Frankly, the vaccine stays in the muscle in your arm. It doesn't go anywhere near your bits. Doesn't mess up with your ovaries or with your testes. It's not, there's no scientific reason why it should, but also we've now vaccinated so many million people around the world that if it was a problem, we would have seen it by now, and we haven't. And we are looking, that safety monitoring continues. There's a very small number of people that can't have the vaccines for medical reasons, and they're generally people who've had extreme reactions to previous vaccines. So we're talking full anaphylactic reaction, lips swelling up, throat swelling up, have to have adrenaline, go into hospital. If you're one of those people and you carry an adrenaline pen because of a reaction to medicines or vaccines, talk to your GP, and there are other options. Depends which vaccine we give you. The AstraZeneca one is safer for people that have medicine allergies than the Pfizer one. We now know that the vaccine is perfectly safe for pregnant women. We've got hundreds of thousands of women in the UK. Sadly, what we also know is that COVID's really bad for pregnant women. Just in the last month, we've seen several pregnant women die in hospital in the West Midlands because of COVID. And pregnant women, generally, when they catch illnesses, do get sicker than when they're not pregnant, unfortunately. And that's because pregnancy does change your immune system slightly. You're carrying the baby, and you've got a lot more blood circulating, a lot more fluid as well. So some of the illnesses that affect your breathing, particularly if baby's pushing on your lungs, make it more difficult as well. And what we're seeing is that in pregnant women who end up in hospital, about 1 in 10 end up in intensive care. So if you're pregnant or you're thinking about getting pregnant, please get the vaccine, because what we are seeing is COVID's really serious for pregnant women. The final slide I've got, just before we take any questions, just to talk about variants. So viruses change. It's what they do normally. And they change when they jump between people, or sometimes when they jump between humans and other creatures. So, each year we have a flu jab and it's slightly different. That's because the flu virus is really good at jumping between humans. It goes to pigs, it goes to bats, it goes to birds. So each time we get a slightly different variant that the vaccine can't recognize. That's why we have an annual flu jab. Now, fortunately, coronavirus doesn't seem to be very good at jumping backwards and forwards between humans and animals. What it is good at doing is in humans that aren't vaccinated, who have immune systems that aren't working as well. So if they have conditions like HIV and it's untreated, or they're very elderly, the vaccine uses that as a bit of a the virus uses that as a bit of a playground to change. And that's where we get variants. And variants can either be more infectious or more dangerous, or they can cause problems to the vaccine. At the moment, all of the variants we've seen, the vaccines work well against. We are looking at a booster for elderly people in the autumn because where we get variants, it's a bit like a key in the lock. The vaccines are pretty good, but the lock's changed a little bit. And the more keys you've got, the more chance you're going to be able to unlock that door. And in older people, their immune system's just not as strong, so they don't have as many keys. So by giving them a bit of a booster, we just boost up the number of keys so they can kind of overwhelm the virus if they get infected. But most of us won't need a vaccine booster. What we've seen is that once you've had the 2 jabs, you're certainly protected for a couple of years from what we know from the research trials so far. So I hope that's been helpful. There is plenty of information available on the NHS. I would say, please go to trusted sources for your information. I think one of the things that I see a lot of is people listening to any old person they saw on the internet, or a meme or a little GIF they've been sent on WhatsApp, or something they've seen on TikTok, and look at who's giving you the information. Just because it's funny or because they come across smart doesn't mean they are. You trust doctors and nurses when you have a car crash to look after you, or when you're having a baby. So why aren't you trusting them now? So please do make sure you do your research, and don't just listen to some of the have a go heroes on YouTube, because there is some real rubbish out there. And unfortunately, it's confusing people. And there's not a lot we can do about that. I mean, I'm not sure I want to run Facebook, but I don't envy them as a job trying to control it. So do please look for trusted sources. Anyway, I hope that's been okay, guys, and happy to go into questions now.
Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you so much for that. So now we're going to go ahead and read some of the questions that the young people have asked in relation to, the COVID vaccine. So just to put it out there, some of the questions that have been asked, you may have already touched upon or already asked, but for the sake of, just going over them, if it's possible, just want to reiterate them, if that's okay. So the first question that I have here, you already pretty much answered it, but it's how do vaccines work as a general question?
Yeah, so vaccines work by by giving our body a bit of the organism we're trying to defend against. So in the case of the COVID virus, we're showing our body that the protein spike that sits on the surface of the COVID virus, think of it like the button on the coat. So we've taken the button off the coat and we're showing our body the buttons and going, anything that's wearing this button, attack it. And that's how our body then develops the antibody, and the antibody recognizes the button and attacks anything that's wearing the button. It's very specific, though, to the button, to that protein spike. And one of the bits of fake news that's been out there is if you take a picture of the protein spike on a COVID virus and the picture of protein spike on someone's placenta when they're having a baby, the pictures look similar. They're completely different if you look in detail at them, but because the pictures look slightly similar, one of those armchair scientists went, oh, the antibodies must attack the placenta. And of course, that's bad science and it's very inaccurate. So the vaccines work by giving us those protein spikes, those buttons, or giving us the instructions to make them ourselves. And then our body sees the buttons, learns to recognize them and to attack them. And then next time we see anything wearing the buttons, we attack it and defend ourselves. And that's how vaccines work.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Hakin?
Thank you for that explanation, Justin. So we have another question. Say, for example, if a youngster is really healthy, what's the point of taking the vaccination if they're at no risk of, or if they're, of course, they're at a lower risk of getting the coronavirus or appearing with symptoms? What's the point if they eat right, if they sleep right, if they have a good diet? Why should they?
Yeah, so there are two things I'd say to this. I mean, first of all, it's not no risk, it's low risk. So the healthier you are, the lower your risk of getting seriously ill, but it's not no risk. And the small risk is still bigger than any of the risks of having the vaccine. So that's the first thing. Your risk of being sick from COVID is like here, and your risk of having a side effect from the vaccine is down here. So you're still quids in. The second thing, those of you who are local footy fans will know that we have had one of the football players, I think from Birmingham City's been in hospital with COVID. There was a guy who was very anti-vax, who's a DJ, and he's kind of a regular gym goer, big muscle guy. He ended up in intensive care with COVID. So just because you lead a healthy lifestyle doesn't mean you're immune. Just means it's less likely you get really sick. And you know, this is no different from, say, taking the vaccine for meningitis. You know, you're less likely to catch meningitis and be very sick the healthier you are, but it's still there and it's still a chance. And all of those risks are higher than any of the risks with the vaccine. So for the sake of 2 jabs, you're better protecting yourself, frankly.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much for that. Again, another question that the young people have is, how have they managed to make this vaccine so quickly, and does it not usually take years to create a vaccine, and has it been tested properly? I know it's a question that you already asked, but if you could reiterate.
Yeah. Sure. So yeah, the vaccine's gone through all the same steps that any other vaccine would take. We've used science that's already there. So, as I said, the Astrazeneca vaccine works in a similar way to the flu vaccine, in that we're using a virus to introduce the recipe card to make the protein spike the buttons. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines use a slightly newer science, which is mRNA vaccines, where they've got an artificial fat bubble envelope around the instruction sheet, but it's not brand new. It's been used for about a decade for other vaccines before. So the new bit has been swapping out flu virus for COVID virus, and in the other case, I think it was used for Ebola. So they've swapped out the virus instruction sheet, but the actual science of the vaccine is not brand new. And so that's the first thing to say. The second thing is it followed all of the same steps. It was in the lab, it was with animals, it's been with the same number of human trials. We were able to do it faster because, first of all, money was there. They didn't have to go hunting funding. Secondly, all the regulatory committees that were needed met when they were needed. Rather than saying, I'm sorry, I'm too busy, I can't see your application for 6 months. They said, no, we'll see it next Tuesday. So that all moved faster. And third, when you're doing that final stage of trials, when you want lots of people using the vaccine in a place where the illness is happening a lot, the virus is around a lot, sometimes you have to wait till enough of the disease is out there to be able to test it. Well, with COVID, it was all over the place. So they didn't have to wait, and they were able to do trials also actually in lots of different countries at the same time. So one of the really good things we have for the COVID vaccine that we don't normally get is we had trials in Africa, in America, in Canada, in Europe, in South America, all at the same time. And that means actually we can be really confident that the vaccine works just the same in people from different ethnicities. And actually, in most vaccine studies, you don't get that because you don't get that many trials running across the world at the same time. So that also helps us be confident the vaccine works just the same if you're a white person, you're a black person, you're an Asian person, because actually all of those people were involved in the vaccine trials. And it also means we know it's safe in all different types of ethnicities as well, because we looked at safety in lots of different types of people as well.
Thank you. Hakin?
Thank you, Justin. Thanks, Stefan. So, in a kind of biological context, what are the main differences between the three vaccines that we have currently?
So the simplest difference is you've got two vaccines that work that have an artificial envelope, and you have one vaccine where that envelope is another virus. It's a different virus. So AstraZeneca, the instruction card is wrapped up in, basically it's a monkey virus that causes a common cold in monkeys, doesn't do anything to humans, and we inject into that virus the instruction sheet to make the protein, to make the protein spikes those buttons. The Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine work in a different way, where instead of having a monkey virus, they've created this artificial envelope that wraps around the recipe card, and that envelope is really sticky, and it sticks to our muscle cells, and it basically dissolves a little hole in the wall of the muscle cell and introduces the recipe card that way. So that's the difference between them. I'm not as good, to be honest, on things like the Chinese vaccine, which Sinovac, because we haven't had the data. The Janssen vaccine, which is also called the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is the one they use a lot in America, is a bit like the AstraZeneca one. It's using another virus, but I think it's a dead virus, so we call it a zombie vaccine. And I have no idea how the Russian one works, Sputnik, because we don't license either it or the Chinese one at the moment because they won't share their data. So in essence, you've got two that they use this artificial envelope, and one of them is using a monkey virus.
Right. Thank you, Justin.
So one of the questions is from the young people is, can I choose which vaccine I want? And that's pretty much because some of the, I believe some of the ingredients in the Pfizer one has some of the stuff that they're allergic to. So would it be possible to take the Oxford vaccine? Like, can we genuinely choose?
Yeah, so in general, you can't choose just because you fancy it. So you can't say, oh, I'm having an AstraZeneca day, or today I quite fancy Pfizer. And it's really important, actually, you don't mix and match, because if you mix and match, you get 2 first doses, which means you get 2 side effect days. Whereas if you stick with the same one, you only get side effects with the first dose, not the second dose. For people who've got a medicine allergy, and the one that really makes a difference is an allergy to something called PEG, which this is where you're really testing my basic medical training, but it's something like phosphoethanol glycine is what PEG stands for. And if you've got a PEG allergy and you carry an adrenaline pen for it, then talk to your GP and they'll arrange for you to have AstraZeneca, which doesn't have PEG in it. So if you've got a medicines allergy, which means you have an adrenaline pen, your GP is the best route and they will arrange for it. If you go to one of the mass vaccination sites, so if you went to Millennium Point, for example, or to Aston Villa, they have Millennium Point definitely has AstraZeneca and Pfizer, but some of them only have Pfizer. So if you are in that situation, I think first step is talk to your GP and they will make sure you get an appointment. They can usually do AstraZeneca at the practice as well. But for most of us, unless you've got a medical reason, you don't get a choice, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Hakin.
Okay, so Justin, thanks for that. We have a question from Maddie, and she's asking, for young people with medical conditions, will they need to have a third top-up after they've taken the 2 doses?
Yeah, so on this one, I'm not sure, Maddie, to be honest. At the moment, the trial evidence said that people with common medical conditions, things like diabetes, didn't need an extra booster, that they were doing okay. And it was really the most elderly people, or people who were very immunocompromised. So their immune systems don't work very well because they're on very high dose steroids. So some young people, for example, with very bad asthma, very bad lung disease might be on very, very high doses of a steroid called prednisolone, and in which case their immune system doesn't work as well, and they would need a booster. So it will be very much based on what your particular medical condition is, and does it impact on your immune system in a really big way. So if you've got asthma and you just use a brown inhaler and a blue inhaler, you wouldn't need the booster. But if you're someone that has regular steroid injections or steroid nebulizers, or takes very high dose steroids, then you probably will. So it will be based a bit on person by person. But in general, young people are much less likely to need a booster than adults because your immune systems are much better than ours.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the questions that young people are asking is, can I catch COVID by taking the vaccines?
No, that's an absolute no. And the reason it's a no is the vaccine only has in it the instruction card for making the protein on the surface of the vaccine. It is not an instruction card to make the whole virus. It doesn't have the whole virus in it. So the vaccine can't give you the virus.
Thank you. Hakin?
Thank you, Justin. So another question is, do I need to get the vaccine if I've had COVID? If so, how long after having COVID should I get the vaccine?
Yep, good question. So yes, you absolutely should get the vaccine even if you've had COVID. And the reason for this is that what we've seen in the immune studies, so there was a study called REACT that's been going for most of the last year, which was looking at what happened to the people's natural immunity after they had COVID. And what it saw was about a third of people don't develop any natural immunity at all. Our body just doesn't understand what it's been attacked by, doesn't develop antibodies, and therefore is completely vulnerable. About a third of people develop some antibody response, but it doesn't work very well. So it's a bit like we kind of saw the enemy, but we were looking in the other direction. So we built a response, but it really isn't working. And then the final third of people do develop a good antibody response, but about 3 months later, it disappears completely. And even if they get exposed to COVID again, the body's forgotten how to make it. So it can last anywhere between 3 and 6 months, but it seems to wear off much more quickly than other conditions. Now, the reason we think that happens is coronavirus family. You remember I talked about COVID-19's like a type of tomato in the family of tomatoes. In the coronavirus family, you have the common cold. And we all know we catch common cold again and again and again. And that's because our body is really bad at learning how to defend ourselves to it. What's different with the vaccine is because the vaccine's super specific. It's giving you one bit of the virus to learn how to look for. So our body gets much better at going, we just look for the buttons, the protein spikes, and we don't care about anything else. So as long as it's got the button, we're going to attack it and we're going to kill it. And that's why the vaccines work better than natural immunity. So even if you had COVID, you still need the vaccine. It's likely that you will get a better response. There is no rhyme or reason about whether you will or won't get side effects. So I know people who definitely had COVID, had the vaccine and had no side effects. And I know people who had COVID, had the vaccine, had awful side effects. And I know people who definitely didn't have COVID, had the vaccine, had awful side effects. So there's no rhyme or reason on that side. What was the other bit, Hakin? I've gone on so long, I forgot the other bit of the question.
No,
when to have it, wasn't it? Yeah,
it's a lot for you.
No, it's fine. You would have thought after a year and a half, I'd be pretty good at these. If you've had COVID, what we say is you should wait 28 days, about a month, after you've first developed your symptoms before you have the vaccine. Now, that's not because the vaccine is going to make any difference to your current infection. It doesn't shorten how long you're sick for. It's not going to make you any sicker. The reason we don't want you to have it when you're sick with COVID is your body's already fighting the COVID vaccine. If we try and give it something else to fight, it's not fair on your body. So in general, if people are sick, we try not to give them a vaccine anyway. Okay. COVID's no different. So it's normally about 28 days, but at least 2 to 3 weeks after you first develop symptoms.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Justin. So I know you already answered this as well, but one of the questions is, does the vaccine contain alcohol and/or animal products?
It doesn't contain any animal products. but it does contain a very, very small amount of alcohol. It's about the same amount of alcohol that's in bread. And all of the world religions have said that that is absolutely fine. And for anyone who has an alcohol reaction, so you may know some, particularly Chinese people have this, they have a gene missing, which means that when they drink alcohol, they have quite an extreme reaction. They often flush and go red and feel quite unwell. It's not enough alcohol to trigger that. So all of the world faiths have said that very, very small amount of alcohol, which is the same level, as I said, in bread, is perfectly acceptable. It's considered acceptable by Muslim faith, by Hasidic Jews. So the small amount of alcohol is not something to worry about. And there are no animal products. There are also no baby products in there either. There's no fetal product either. So it's perfectly safe for vegans.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for that, Justin. We have another question from Maddie. She says that, will the vaccine be a yearly... I think she's saying...
will it be
we'll get
yearly
it? Yeah. Will it be yearly? No, I don't think so at the moment. So the reason we give... The only vaccine we do give yearly is flu. And the reason we give the flu jab yearly is because flu, frankly, is a bit of an annoying little virus. It jumps backwards and forwards between animals and humans. And when it does that, the protein spikes, the buttons on the jacket that our body recognizes, change quite a lot. So every year we've got to change the flu jab because the virus has jumped into another animal and changed its code. Now, coronavirus doesn't seem to do that as much. COVID-19 hasn't really demonstrated the ability to jump from animals to humans and back to humans, which is the key bit. There is sadly evidence that cats and dogs can catch COVID, but what they can't do is give it to humans. So as long as that stays true, we won't need an annual jab for everyone. If we see a new variant where it's gone into an animal and come back to a human and changed a lot, then we might need a booster dose. But at the moment, there's no need to. It's not behaving the way that flu does. And hopefully, we'll be able to vaccinate everyone before it gets to that stage.
Thank you, Justin. Stefan, I think that answers the next question that we were going to ask.
Yeah, it pretty much answers, that question. The question anyway would have been, should I get the vaccine if I have symptoms of COVID? I think you've answered this twice on 2 different occasions. So yeah. Just going to skip to the next question if that's okay. So the next question onwards from that is, will the vaccine stop me from getting COVID?
No. It won't stop you completely. It will reduce your chances of getting COVID. If you do catch COVID, it reduces your chances of passing it on to other people. So it's not perfect, no medicine is. So we know that the vaccine reduces your chances of catching it by about 70%, give or take. Okay. And if you catch COVID, it reduces your chances of passing it on to other people by about 40%. So that's why we still need people who are in contact with cases to isolate and get a test. But if they're vaccinated, we're a bit more relaxed. It's not perfect, no medicine is. What it is pretty perfect at, which is quite incredible actually, given it's a new vaccine, new disease, is it reduces your chances of ending up in hospital and dying by about 95%. And that's amazing. So, even if your risk is low because you're young, fit and healthy and you eat healthily, you don't smoke, you go to the gym all the time, you still will have a chance of ending up dying or ending up in hospital. And to reduce that by 95% is pretty big. So, that's why the vaccine is really important. But unfortunately, there is still a chance you can catch it. There's still a chance you can feel a bit rough with it, but it's very, very unlikely you end up in hospital or seriously unwell with it. We're still waiting to see whether it reduces your chances of getting long COVID. And there is some evidence emerging that it probably does reduce your chances of getting long COVID, which is another reason to get it, because long COVID doesn't match how sick you are. You can have very, very mild or even no symptoms with COVID and still develop long COVID. And if the vaccine reduces that, it's another reason to have it.
Thank you for that, Justin. Justin, we're going to be rounding up at 6 o'clock. Everyone, we're finishing at 6 o'clock, hopefully. So don't worry, you don't have long left. I know you've been talking for a while, and just take a drink, you know, have some water. I know it's nerve-wracking doing presentations, but we're just going to go on to the last 3 questions because I feel the 2 before that have been asked already, have been answered already by you. So the 3 last questions. The first one is, I'm worried about the time between the 2 vaccines. Why is this so long? You can answer that whenever.
Yeah, so in general, when we're giving 2 doses of a vaccine, think of it a bit like sitting your GCSEs and A-levels. So your GCSEs get you pretty good at French, but if you do A-level French, you're going to be fluent for the rest of your life. And even if I asked you 10 years later, you'd still be pretty good. Whereas if you only did GCSE French like I did, and I did really badly in GCSE French, I can probably get away with bonjour and je voudrais and Coke. And that's about the limit of what I've got. So that's why we have the 2 doses, to kind of really lock in that learning for life. Now, the original research was done on a 4-week window. And with some of the vaccines, and with some of the vaccines, they tried different lengths. And in general, what we saw was the longer you leave between the 2 doses, the better the defense. And that's why if you think about your measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, you have 3 doses, but they're spread out across 3 or 4 years. You don't have them all together. And the same is true for the COVID vaccine. There's kind of a sweet spot. If we leave it too long, then there's a chance people will catch COVID between the 2 doses. If we do it too close together, they get good in response to begin with, but it wears off quicker. So that's why the 8 weeks is the kind of perfect window, because it's that balance between when we're not leaving you unprotected for too long, but actually you get really good defense and it lasts for a long time. If we do it at 4 weeks, you get okay defense, but it tends to wear off faster. And that's what the research is showing now. So although the UK was going out a bit on a limb to do it to begin with, the evidence actually backed it up in the international trials. So most countries have now moved to the 8-week window as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin.
So I know you've already answered this question multiple times, so I'm just going to skip this one. But the question anyway was, what are the side effects of these vaccines? I know you've already explained those. So one of the questions that young people asked is there anyone who shouldn't get the vaccine?
No, is the short answer. There are some people where we need to think about when they take the vaccine. So the 2 groups where you think about when is, first of all, people who need cancer treatment. And that's because cancer treatment basically destroys your immune system. So if someone needs cancer treatment, then what we do is we give them the 2 doses closer together, and we probably will give them a booster dose. And we try and do those doses before they have to start their cancer treatment. The other time we think about when we give it is when women are pregnant, because in general, we try to avoid giving women any extra medicine in the first third of their pregnancy, the first trimester, or the last third, because at the beginning, anything you mess around with can increase the chance of a miscarriage, whether it's giving them antibiotics or giving them a vaccine. And in the last third, it can increase the chance that the baby might come early. So we try and do the jabs for pregnant women in the middle third, which is fortunately 12 weeks. So you can get your 8 weeks in between the 2 doses in the middle third. But other than that, pretty much everyone can have the vaccine. And if you have an allergy to PEG or to medicines or vaccines in the past, talk to your GP, because the Astrazeneca one is safer for you than the Pfizer one. And we've seen very, very little evidence of actual allergic reactions to either vaccine. But to be on the extra safe side, we'd probably give you AstraZeneca rather than Pfizer. But there are no clinical reasons why we wouldn't give people these vaccines. And as I said, it's just more about timing.
Thank you, much appreciated. And the very last question that we have from young people is, what is herd immunity, and what does this mean for people who are non-vaccinated?
Yeah, so herd immunity is something you'll have seen in the media, and there was a lot of kind of, oh, this is exciting, this might save us all at the beginning. And herd immunity is the idea that if about 90 to 95% of the population are immune to a disease, the disease has got nowhere to go. The virus has nowhere to go. So if you vaccinate, or through a combination of vaccination and people who've already caught the virus and have natural immunity, you get to that magic 90-95% figure, then the virus basically runs out of places to go and it dies out. And we do that with smallpox. So smallpox is an example of, across the world, over 90% of the world are vaccinated. So smallpox basically runs out places to go, and smallpox is now virtually unheard of in developed countries because of herd immunity. The problem for COVID-19 is that bit I was saying before, where if you've had COVID-19 infection, your natural immunity, your body forgets after about 3 to 6 months. And until at the moment, we're only about 70% of the whole country have had their first jab. So we're still a long way off that 90 to 95% from vaccine protection. And because we forget how to protect ourselves after natural infection, that herd immunity is very, very unlikely to happen. If we if natural immunity was more effective, we wouldn't have had the second and third wave. So the kind of best example about why that doesn't work is if those of us that got infected in the first wave, which was probably a large proportion of the population, developed a decent natural immunity, we wouldn't have had lockdown again in the autumn, because we would have all been immune, the virus would have run out of places to go. But the reality is that's not what happens, and therefore we're not protected. So until more of us are vaccinated, we're a long way off herd immunity, I'm afraid.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much. Hakin?
Thank you, Justin. Thanks for coming in today and really clearing our doubt on vaccinations and giving us some really good information and facts. I think that's it for today. So,
and also, just want to say thank you for all of the young people for also attending this webinar today and asking additional questions as well. I think that from the information that we've been given today, I think a lot of us will be able to make a formulated opinion based on fact rather than speculation. So again, thank you, Justin, and thank you, young people, for tuning into this webinar today.
And a huge thank you to Stephen and Hakin from St Basil's Youth Advisory Board. And Justin, thank you for your time. That's been a really great session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. See you soon.
Yeah, bye.
See you on the next one.
Bye. There's a next one.
There's a lot of things. There's a lot of different things going on. St Basil's. So we'll see. Hopefully, we'll see you next time sometime, Justin. We love your company. Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
thank you so much.
Bye-bye.